Good afternoon and welcome to our second session of More Time for Books. As we prepare for Passover, we're also in the midst of a pandemic. Regardless, we all want to keep on learning and socializing within our networks and possibly create new networks such as this one. I'm Vivian Lieber. I'm a Vice President of Women's League and Chair of the Women's League Reads program and books in general. Women's League Reads, I just want to tell you a little about it if you're not familiar, is a member benefit program of Women's League among its rich educational offerings. We just announced our next author interview, which is Goldie Goldblum, who's a fascinating young woman. Her novel On Division tells the story of a middle-aged Hasidic woman in Brooklyn who was testing the boundaries and her individuality during a crisis. To join Women's League Reads, please send an email to Lois Silverman, lsilverman@wlcj.org, with your sisterhood's name and information or your Women's League membership number to join Women's League Reads and get all the information. I'd like to acknowledge today we have Margie Miller, wave Margie, our International President of Women's League, and Rabbi Ellen Wollensfield, who is the Executive Director, who's helping us today. And we're going to, just a minute, I'll introduce our main presenters. Let's see, are you ready? Last week we had our first session. We discussed books that have been adapted into films, old classics and newer ones. So today the topic is biography and memoir. We decided that by popular vote at the end of last session. Next, we're going to skip next week because of Pesach, and the following week, Tuesday, April 14th, we hope to return, same time. And right now we had a vote to cover books about humor and satire, in the field of humor and satire. So we'll probably do that. And please send me your ideas for future sessions. So in this series, we're not focusing only on Jewish authors and topics, though we like to find a Torah thread in every book, in all literature. So that's always possible. So now let me introduce you first to Rachel Kamen, who is wave to us, Rachel, and you can unmute yourself if you wish. Rachel is going to lead us off, and then we'll hear from Susan Faber. Susan, wave again. Okay, who will also introduce some books. And then we'll have some audience participation. I have a few books also to present. If you want to say something, there's a chat box. And I hope someone monitors it. Oh, and Barbara Esring, I saw you before. If you wave at us, or Barbara's going to take some notes of any other books that are mentioned so that we can share that with you later. If you send me an email later, I'll share that list with you by tomorrow or the next day. So I think it's time to begin. So I'd like to introduce Rachel Kamen first. She's the director of the Joseph and May Gray Cultural and Learning Center at the North Suburban Synagogue, Bethel, in Highland Park, Illinois. She's also a leader in the Association of Jewish Libraries. She facilitates a number of book groups, including her own sisterhoods and that of the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership in Chicago. After Rachel, we'll hear from Susan Faber. Susan lives in Cincinnati after growing up in New York City and living for a time in Europe. She teaches part-time in different disciplines, grade levels, serving students with a range of needs. She is also books chair for the Central Great Lakes region and on the region board. So Rachel, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much, Vivian. So I thought this would be easier. I tried to make slides so that, if you can't totally hear the names and the authors, here's the information. And I'm happy to send this out, to anyone who wants me to send them a copy. So after a decade as a political speechwriter, serving as head speechwriter for First Lady Michelle Obama and a senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama. And then she was also the chief speechwriter for Hillary Clinton on her 2008 presidential campaign. Sarah Hurwitz enrolled in an Introduction to Judaism class completely on a whim. She was blown away by what she learned in the class, and that led to years of study, which then led her to write this book, Here All Along, Finding Meaning, Spirituality, and a Deeper Connection to Life in Judaism After Finally Choosing to Live There. She shares her journey and what she learned in a very interesting, entertaining, and accessible way. And it actually, the book really reminded me of Abigail Pogrebin's book from 2 years ago, My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, which I also highly recommend. So, and I just received an email yesterday from opendoormedia.org, which used to be Jerusalem U, if anyone's familiar with them. And they're putting out a Game Changers video series. And Sarah Hurwitz, the author of this book, was recently featured. So you can watch a 30-minute video interview with her for free. And I put the URL up there. It's just unpack.education/videos. But if you Google Sarah Hurwitz Game Changers, it'll come up too. And then they also have Nathan Sharansky, Yossi Klein Halevi, Ilan Gold, and Barry Weiss are also being featured on that video series. So something to check out. But I really enjoyed Here All Along by Sarah Hurwitz. And I just also should mention, I love memoirs. I've been reading a lot of memoirs lately, and I think it's just a great genre to put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. This author is Mara Gad, and her biological mother was an unwed white Jewish teenager, and her biological father was African American. And as an infant in 1970, she was adopted by a white Jewish family from Chicago. And even though she grew up surrounded by a loving and supportive immediate family, she realized at an early age that she didn't quite fit in. In Black spaces, she wasn't quite Black enough, and she was told that you couldn't be Black and Jewish. And in Jewish spaces, she was often mistaken for the help, or asked to leave, or worse. She also faced racism and hostility from her own extended family, forcing her to cut off ties with those relatives who didn't want to accept her. But then 15 years after being estranged from her great aunt Nettie, she was forced to reconnect when the family learned that Aunt Nettie was suffering from Alzheimer's, and Mara was the only one in a position to help and intervene. And Mara watches as the disease erases her aunt's racism, making space for a relationship that was never possible. The Color of Love is a really interesting, heartfelt, and thought-provoking memoir about race, religion, identity, family, memory, forgiveness, love. It's all in there. The audiobook is narrated by the author, and Mara Gad is a trained actress, and she did an excellent job as an audiobook narrator, and I found it extremely compelling. Then the other memoir that we mentioned last week is Inheritance by Dani Shapiro. And Dani Shapiro is a self-professed serial memoirist. She has documented her personal life in 4 memoirs over the course of a decade. It's kind of interesting, like, how can someone's life be that interesting that they've written 4, now 5 memoirs about it? But Dani Shapiro has. And after 4 memoirs, she thought she had become quite certain of who she was until, on a whim, she took one of those at-home DNA tests and discovered that her biological father was not her biological father. So at age 54, she sets out on a journey to discover the truth behind her conception, her paternity, and the secrets that each of her parents kept out of shame, out of self-protectiveness, out of denial, and the secrets that they kept in the name of love. Inheritance has been a runaway bestseller. It has inspired the popular podcast Family Secrets, which has been downloaded more than 11 million times. It's really interesting. what DNA Shapiro had found is when she was doing book events and speaking events, all these readers would come up to her and say, well, this is my story. You know, I had a similar story. I took a DNA test and learned this. And she just started learning all these interesting stories. So she started this podcast where in every episode she has a different person on and they tell their story of a family secret discovered. I've listened to, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 episodes so far, and really, really fascinating. And then supposedly I mentioned last week, it's being made into a movie. So it's kind of interesting to have a memoir made into a movie, but we'll see if that happens. I've been discussing inheritance with my book clubs, and it's been a great for book club discussions, really a lot to talk about. And in every group that I've done it with, I think I've done it with 3 groups, somebody in the group has had one of those family secret experiences that they've been willing to share. At least one person in the group has been willing to share similar experiences that they've had. So this is something that, you know, really affects us all, as millions and millions and millions of people are getting these DNA testing, and they're saying that 2% of people get some sort of surprising results. So this next one is a book I read a couple years ago, The Bridge Ladies by Betsy Lerner. And Betsy Lerner's mother had been playing bridge with the same 5 friends for over 50 years every Monday afternoon, dressed in fashionable outfits, heels, hair and makeup done. They still serve lunch on linen and china and use their silver. And so Betsy joins the group and learns how to play. And through the bridge is finally able to face years of misunderstanding and family tragedy. And the bridge table becomes the common ground that she and her mother never had. The Bridge Ladies is a nice, touching, entertaining mother-daughter and friendship story that sheds light on how different things were for women in previous generations. And bridge players will certainly enjoy it, but non-bridge players will also gain a greater understanding and appreciation of the game. This was a past Women's League Read selection, and you can listen to a conversation with the author at the Women's League Read website. I put the link up there. And this is, I love audiobooks. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. Don't listen to this one on audiobook. Read it. The audiobook narrator was awful. So she did that like stereotypical annoying New York accent for every single character, and it was really bad. And she completely butchered like every Jewish term. I remember she was saying something like kibbutzing. I'm like, what is she talking about? Kibitzing. She was saying kibitzing. So don't listen on audio. Get the print book or the ebook. It was really a good one. And then this last one is not a Jewish one, but it's the best memoir that I have read in a long time, Educated by Tara Westover. It's one of New York Times 10 best books of 2018. It was included on President Barack Obama's favorite books of the year list and Bill Gates' holiday reading list, plus numerous additional awards and accolades. And I can assure you that it really lived up to all the hype. I was a little late to the party, and I thought this book can't be as good as everybody says it is. It is as good and better as everybody says it is. You know, my reaction was just wow, like wow. I couldn't believe this book. It's powerful, thoughtful, heartbreaking, inspiring. It's a memoir about a young woman who was born in Idaho to an extremist, fanatical father who was opposed to public education, and a mother who was a self-taught herbalist and midwife. Tara Westover was 17 before she stepped foot in a classroom for the first time, and despite having no financial support and enduring extreme physical and emotional abuse, she went on to earn a PhD from Cambridge. The audiobook won the Audio Award for Autobiography Memoir, and it won the Audio Award for the Best Female Narrator in 2018. So the audiobook was excellent. I really couldn't turn it off. I would sit in the garage, sit in parking lots, you know, not wanting to get out of my car because I was so captivated with this story. And so if you haven't already read or listened to Educated, move it to the top of the list. You need something to read on a Shabbat afternoon or over Yom Tov, like you will read this book in one sitting. And I think the little tie-in is that education is such an important Jewish value, and reading a story like this made me realize how much most of us take it for granted. I think, you know, I was always surrounded by people who valued formal education. And so it was really eye-opening to have a glimpse into this segment of our society that doesn't share that value in education, and how hard it is to kind of fight that. So I really admire Tara Westover. After I read the book, I, you know, Googled her and I watched a lot of videos. She did a lot of interviews, and she was just as incredible in person, you know, to see her online and video. And then I just added 2 more. These 2 books I have not read these. They're on my nightstand right now. What We Will Become, A Mother, a Son, and a Journey of Transformation by Mimi LeMay. It's about a mother who shares both her transgender child's journey and her journey outside the boundaries of the Orthodox Jewish community she was raised in. So that's on my nightstand, along with on a kind of a similar topic, Becoming Eve by Abby Stein. And Abby Stein is a former member of Brooklyn's founding Hasidic Jewish family. And the book traces the remarkable story of how she transitioned from a non-English speaking rabbinic leader to a woman, an outspoken advocate for gender freedom. So those are both on my nightstand right now. I'm hoping to get to them soon. I use Goodreads and Facebook. I share most everything that I read on Goodreads and Facebook. So if you're interested in my reviews of those 2 books, just follow me on Facebook or Goodreads. If you're on Goodreads, just send me a friend request. If you're on Facebook, send me a friend request, and you can follow along. Or if there's anyone who has read either of these books and already and can share, that would be great.
Okay. Rachel? Rachel?
Yeah?
You're done with your
Yeah,
with that
that's what
part?
I've got. Yeah.
So before we move on, I just want to see if anyone has a comment or question about the books we just discussed briefly. I saw that Eileen asked a question on chat about Mara. Does anyone have a comment or question for Rachel or someone else?
Can we get a copy of this to send the slideshow?
Yeah, I can send it. Yep. And I can send it
Hello.
as a PDF too.
Hello.
Yes?
Hi, my name is Suzanne Rickles. I'm in Houston, so I
I
turned it a little late. What was the name of the first book that you gave? Yeah,
The first
before
one.
that. No, the
Yep.
one after that.
Here All Along,
And then there was another one right after that. Is The Color of
The Color of Love by Mara Gad,
I think I read
Inheritance by Danny
Inheritance
Shapiro,
of the Dead.
Bridge Ladies, and Educated.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, excellent. So a lot to read. Let's now hear from Susan Faber. There are some slides, it continues, or
Yes.
there we
we're
go.
ready. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to ask and I probably should ask this earlier. Here in Cincinnati or in Ohio, all the beauty salons have to close. So no one's going to go and get their hair done. So I thought that while a lot of us take advantage of these things, I thought I had remembered reading this book, and a number of years ago when I first started doing book reviews for Central Great Lakes, I did a review of this book about Helena Rubinstein. And much like the last book that we interviewed Talia Carner, is it, about the third daughter, and
Yes.
how we have this young woman who's growing up in the very oppressive, very brutally impoverished world of of Russia, the Pale. Well, Helena Rubinstein is also someone who comes from Poland in tremendous poverty, and she has a different trajectory in her life. And Michel Fitoussi, who wrote this book originally in French, puts together the trajectory of her life from poverty to Australia to so forth, and how she took advantage of her mother's constant teaching her that there's this wonderful cream. Get in the habit of using this cream. And the cream was invented by some Polish person. And she figured out the recipe, or was able to get the recipe from him. And so that was the beginning of her career, creating the beauty products she created. If we can go to the next, let me think, I don't remember. We're kind of something's happening to the slides. But this other book by Ruth Brandon that I read about, I have not read this book, but I thought it was going to be interesting. We have to go back a slide, Rachel, I'm sorry. This Ugly Beauty by Ruth Brandon. This book is interesting because not only is it about Helena Rubinstein, but it talks about another man from France who developed L'Oreal, and he was a chemist, Eugène Schuller, and his work in creating beauty products for women. And so I just thought it was going to be an interesting read for any of us who are interested in these people's trajectories. Next slide about Leonard Cohen. The reason I picked out these two books is I recently had a chance to watch a DVD that through the public library about Mariana, a Norwegian woman who was the love of Leonard Cohen's life, even though they never married and they did not have children. He ended up on one of his intervals living back in Montreal, marrying another Jewish woman he knew from the Montreal community. And with this woman, he had his one son, Adam Cohen. So, but it was later revealed that Mariana, who was really the love of his life, and he wrote a lot of songs inspired by her and his relationship with her and his life with her on the island of Hydra in Greece, in the Mediterranean. But what made, I've lost my train of thought, I'm sorry, but what made his life kind of interesting with Mariana, she had numerous abortions, because she knew that they both were challenged emotionally. And Leonard Cohen's mother was institutionalized. And what's very interesting is he himself went into intervals of tremendous depression and presented concerts in England in institutions for people with emotional problems. So there are a lot of things about Leonard Cohen's life that are very revealing, and maybe that's why Lil Lebovich wrote his title, Broken Hallelujah. So we can go to the next slide. And then this last book, last week when we were talking about the connection between books and films, Vivian pointed out the power of the novel Exodus by Leon Uris, followed by the movie. And so I thought that I found this book about Leon Uris and the Americanization of Israel's founding story. Yes, it's a Wayne State University press, it's an academic press, but based on what I read about it, it's still relatively readable for anybody to enjoy. And then there are these other two books that were mentioned in this review of this book. So I just wanted to bring to light some of the historic or memoir biography books we can look at to help us further appreciate whether it's the music of someone, the poetry of someone, the literature they've written, or the lives they've led and the contributions they've made to us as individuals. So I'm basically finished with my presentation.
Thank you, Susan. That was, both presentations were wonderful. And I'd like to ask if anyone I had one comment about
Yeah, sure.
Leonard Cohen, that I I think it was in the fall, I was at the Jewish Museum in New York City, where they had a fabulous multimedia presentation of his life. It took over the whole ground floor and part of the other floors. It was wonderful. The four walls of the room were covered with film about his life and excerpts and interviews and his music at different concerts at different ages and his poetry readings, and other rooms had all kinds of multimedia things going on. And I really hadn't been such a fan or followed him that closely, but I became a big fan from that exhibit, if nothing else. So thank you. Does anyone else have a comment or a question about those books?
And this last slide that Rachel's put together for us, I just thought it was kind of, a lot of what I read is nonfiction. I'm very intrigued by a lot of new books coming out. Unfortunately, or as it is, they tend to be from academic presses like the University of California Press or Wayne State University Press in Detroit. But we have a lot of younger people, probably for their dissertations in history or literature, that they're discovering and trying to make sense of things that have happened in the past, how we define ourselves as Jews, how we construct our lives as Jews. And I'm kind of fascinated by all that because I think we're still figuring all that out. Right now, I'm reading a book that I was able to borrow from the Clow Library. Again, it's an academic book, and it's written by, published by Brandeis University Press. It's also about how we teach. It's a series of chapters analyzing how we teach others about Jewish identity and how we help young people, understand what it is to be a Jew. And I'm very intrigued by this. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm reading. If I could follow up on how Rachel shared what she's fascinated by, which kind of reminded me of how we've interviewed through Women's League Reads, Vivian. I think this is early on in the process. There was Joy Ladin was interviewed about her identity challenges and how she had so much gender dysphoria and how that's pushed her to become Joy Ladin. And it's amazing that she still has her academic position and her influence and capacity to still interact with young people and help them. So
That's right. That was during the administration of Women's League Reads with Janet Kirshner and Ellen Bresnick that book was covered. Okay, those were both, a lot of good books have been presented. I have a few in the memoir and biography category, and some of them I've read a few years ago, so I tried to refresh myself. I have a copy here. So Jumping Over Shadows, a memoir by Annette Gendler. And Annette has spoken to some of our sisterhoods. It's a stirring book because she was non-Jewish. She fell in love with a Jewish man when living in Germany. She's a native German in 1985. And later she learned through research, that her German great aunt had also been married to a Jew before World War II. And that was a very fraught marriage. She was very devoted to that aunt, but the aunt was she was from an extended family that had Nazis in it, and she had married a Jew. So she tied that in with her own relationship, with Annette's own relationship and her conversion to Judaism. So it's quite a stirring book, and it's a paperback, so I recommend that. And moving to the next one, The Cape House is a memoir by Ria Bachner. And I think both might be self-published, but it's good. And not every book can be picked up by a major publisher. She wrote about her personal journey in life, especially the 6 weeks that she went to the family's home, summer home on the Cape Cod, where her mother was dying of cancer. So she spent those 6 weeks with her mother. And although she just recounted the story of her mother's over that 6 weeks, how she approached death, and it's sad in that respect. She also traveled back and forth in time to her family relationships and her mother's life story and her own life story, where she had some interesting journeys, and there were stories of addiction that was overcome. So there are some very moving parts to the book. She also discovers a lot about herself, and so I recommend this book as well. The next one is Angela's Ashes. Okay, no Jewish connection, except that he came to New York, and Frank McCourt became an English teacher at Stuyvesant High School at a time when there were many Jewish children there. He only passed away a few years ago. He wrote this book after a lifetime being a teacher, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. And he wrote some subsequent follow-up books, and it's his story of being from an extremely impoverished Irish family that came from Ireland to New York and then went back to Ireland, and they were desperately poor. There were many children in the family. Many of them died because of the horrendous conditions they lived under. They were starving, but it's not a grim book. There's a lot of humor in it, where he's self-deprecating humor and funny stories, like the time as a boy, he had to carry the lunch pail to a boarder in their home every day. They got paid for bringing him lunch, but he couldn't resist. He was hungry, and he couldn't resist. He might have been 9 or 10 years old, taking one little small bite. Well, by the time he reached the man's workplace, which I believe was in the mines, there was nothing left. So it's a great book. Let's move on. Okay, Ruth Gruber. I think everyone has heard of her. She's an icon. She is an amazing woman who grew up in Brooklyn in an Orthodox home, and she announced her family she was going to study in Germany, of all places, and she was going for a PhD. She actually fell in love with a German man in the years preceding World War II, but fortunately, for many reasons, the relationship broke up. She came back. She was the youngest PhD in America at the time, I think at age 20. And she had a life then also, in contradiction to the life her mother would have chosen. She became a correspondent for the the New York Herald Tribune. And in that capacity, she also was involved in it with FDR and the administration, representing the administration, because she was a fluent Yiddish speaker in the story of the refugees who came by boat to America. She was an intervening person as a translator. She also wrote her story. There are 3 memoirs here. The Fur Haven, the story of the 1,000 World War II refugees and how they came to America. Then Ahead of Time, my early years as a foreign correspondent. She was quite a diminutive woman with a big heart and a great sense of adventure. She was also a photographer, so she took wonderful photos as she went. Then Inside of Time, this was a little later, her journey from Alaska to Israel after Israel was founded. So if you haven't read these books, I certainly recommend them. She died also only a few years ago, I think. So thank you. That's finally, I will mention the book Dirty Wars and Polished Silver. The author, Linda Schuster, she was a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and another publication, which I forgot, but she was in hotspots around the world that were facing war. And then her first husband actually was also a war correspondent, and he was killed. I'm not sure, I don't remember if it was Iraq or Syria, but one of the hotspots. He didn't make it. She continued to be a journalist, and then she met a man who was an U.S. ambassador, and she married him and ended up, that's where the polished silver comes from. So she has had quite a life. She's still with us. I spoke with her on the phone. We spoke because she would have liked to be a featured author with Women's League Reads, and we only have 4 books a year usually to present the author. So we didn't choose her book, but I still do recommend it. And it's an exciting book that has lessons for us of another woman who had a lot of courage and had to reinvent her life as well after her first husband was killed in a horrible way. It's reminiscent of the story of Daniel Pearl a little bit. Okay, thank you. I think that comes to conclusion of my part. And I want to ask the audience now to please say, I'm going to ask someone else to, like the rabbi maybe, to help me monitor either the chat box, and later we will also ask people on the phone. There are 20 people on the phone as well. That's a little challenging, but may I have comments or other books that you want to present?
Can I start?
Yes.
So first of all, Vivian, you blow me away every time you speak, that you have such a depth of knowledge. It's incredible. We know Rachel does this for a living, but wow, it's incredible. My comment actually combines what we spoke about last week and this week. If people are watching, and I don't want to give any, spoilers, but if anyone's watching Unorthodox on Netflix, it's also a book. I read the book many years ago by Deborah Feldman, I think like the day it came out. It's very different. Have you watched it? The movie and the book. I actually preferred the book more so than the yeah. But it's worth reading and seeing both, just to put it out there. And that was my only comment. But who has and thank you for letting me do that.
Yes, okay, thanks.
Have you
It's on
seen it
my
or
list
read
to
it?
watch. Susan, you were going to jump back in, your hand's up?
Yes, I'm back in. Thank you, Vivian. Kudos to Vivian and to Rachel for joining me on this. And I just wanted to mention, with all the books that Vivian mentioned by Ruth Gruber, my husband and I took a road trip in the summer of 18 through upstate New York on our way to Massachusetts. And we stopped in Oswego, where Ruth Gruber's personal library is housed in the Safe Haven building, which is the repository of all kinds of realia and documentation of those 1,000 refugees that were taken in by the Oswego community. And there's a lot of things there to give you a sense of how the community welcomed them and help them transition to becoming American citizens eventually during the time of the war. So I just thought, for those of you who are really into history, it is adjacent to one of the few forts that are around still from the pre-revolutionary times, continued usage in that area of New York State. And the state of New York has really worked on having a very updated display of American history, as well as display in Safe Haven of this little piece of American history of how one of the rare moments that 900 Jews and 100 Christians were given refuge by the Oswego, New York Jewish community. So I just wanted to point that out, because I think it's, we see examples of that sometimes and sometimes not today.
And I think, Margie, I think you were mentioning that earlier today.
Yeah,
Even.
I watched the other day a documentary on PBS all about her, and I really didn't know much about her. By the time I got done, I was a massive fan. She only died a couple of years ago. She was 105. But if you get to see that documentary on PBS, search for it. It was well worth watching.
And Susan, thank you for your presentation as well.
I didn't know about that documentary, Margie. Thank you. So let's see. If someone else in the audience wants to comment about a book, or introduce a new book, please unmute yourself.
Marjorie wants to.
Marjorie?
I unmuted you. Then you unmuted yourself.
Go ahead, Marjorie.
Wait, you're not unmuted yet. I'll unmute you. Don't touch the, oh, there she is. Okay.
Okay. Vivian, as I mentioned to you the other day, I'd like to mention a book for everyone that is not a Jewish book, except for the fact that he is probably the youngest MacArthur Genius Fellowship winner, because he did it when he was 22 years old, before his first book was ever published. Probably was based mostly on his poetry that was published in the New Yorker magazine, among other places. The name of the book is On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous. It's a strange title. On Earth, we're briefly gorgeous. And his name is Ocean Vuong, V-U-O-N-G. Isn't it a lovely title? It made me want to just take the book up and read it quickly. I didn't want to stick it on the stack. I wanted to put it on the top. This is his first book, and as I said, he's previously published poetry in the New Yorker magazine, so some of you may be familiar with him. The citation from the MacArthur Genius Fellowship said in part that he was being recognized for marrying folkloric traditions with linguistic experimentation in works that explore the effects of intergenerational trauma, the refugee experience, and the complexities of identity and desire with eloquence and clarity. And the library Library Books Review says that he's a poet and fiction writer whose works explore the ongoing trauma of war and conditions of exile with tragic eloquence and clarity. The child of illiterate rice farmers in rural Vietnam, Vuong came to the United States as a refugee with his family at the age of 2. His poetry is infused with rhythms, cadence, and imagery of rural Vietnamese oral storytelling and folkloric traditions married to a restless experimentation with the English language. This book, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, is written as a letter to his illiterate mother, who will never be able to read it. It explores his growth from a child through his teens. The prose reads like poetry. You're just sucked in by it. It's very short. Anyone can easily read this book in a day. It's slightly over 100 pages. And that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
You know,
Marjorie.
it's one of those books that you read and it doesn't leave you. Months later, all of a sudden, you'll have an odd thought about this person. Another book that I thought I would mention is, I can't find the name of it. Wait a minute, I think it's right here somewhere. It's something about, the title is, you know what, maybe I shouldn't do this because I can't.
You know what, later you can send it to me
I'll send
in
it to
writing
you.
and we'll include it in the book list.
It's about a man who is in training to be a pulmonologist, and he develops a very rapidly growing cancer. Again, very poetic literature, though it is a memoir. And in the end, his wife finishes it for him because he has already died. It's an amazing book. It's something about breath and air. Rats.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry about that.
Okay, we'll send me the title link later. It's fine.
I found
Does
it.
anyone else
I
want?
found it.
Okay.
It's called When Breath Becomes Air, and his name is Paul Kalenthi, K-A-L-E-A-N-T-H-I. And it's a story of his struggle to complete medical school while he is dealing with this disease and trying to fight to make graduation, so he will hear someone call him Dr. Kalenthi before he dies. Very, very well done. Very well written.
Okay, thank you, Marjorie. That's
Highly recommend them both. Thank you. Thank you
Does-
for letting me recommend those, Vivian.
all right. Thank you. Does anyone else want to present a book that they love or want us to read? That's
I'd like
in biography and memoir. Is that Martha?
Yes,
Go ahead.
I'd like to share a book written by one of just, I think, the great memoir teachers, Natalie Goldberg, who wrote about old friends from far away. She teaches memoir, but her book itself, I have used to teach memoir in our temple. And it's really a guideline to the whole concept of getting into the philosophy. And I wrote this down from a class I took with her. The therapist is like the mommy and you are the baby. But in memoir, you're the mommy and the reader's the baby.
Thank you. Martha, where are you from? Which sisterhood?
Congregation Beth Shalom in Clearwater, Florida.
Thank you. Great.
Excuse me, may I make a comment? My name is Suzanne. I asked a question earlier. This is the first I've known about this. Just got this list from my sister yet today. And I want to thank everybody for what sounds like a lot of hard work they put together. And wonderful suggestions for a book club I belong to that I fear may not start up again. But there's some wonderful suggestions, and I wanted to thank everybody for their hard work.
Okay, thank you. And as we said, the PowerPoint, that presentation you saw before from Rachel, as well as any other books that were mentioned, we are taking notes, so it will be shared. But since we didn't have pre-registration for this call, so I don't know who's on it. So you'll have to send me an email requesting. Is there an easier way to do that? I can put it into, also share it with Women's League Reads. And other than that, if you're in the not in the Women's League Reads program, well, you should join, but if you don't right away, send me an email and then we'll get it to you that way. Thank you. Anyone else have a book they want to present?
What is your email address?
V Lieber, L-E-B-E-R. I'll say again, V is for Vivian, L-E-B as in boy, E-R, at WLCJ.org.
And Vivian, maybe you could write it in the chat. And did Naomi want to say something? Oh, you did. Somebody wrote it already. Good job, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just I was looking, I'm on my computer and I was just looking at memoirs, and I think just to bring to everyone's attention, the Jewish Women's Archive, if you look at memoirs, they have a whole list of them. And I mean, some of them I've actually read and some of them we'll mention this evening. But Nora Ephron's Heartburn is probably worthwhile.
Yes.
Ilana Kershon's, which I think was one of your books,
Yes.
is mentioned there. You Won't Regret This by Abby Jacobson. And there are a whole list. I'm just looking. Tova Mirvis, whose book I read, Journey from Orthodoxy to Memoir. Abby Bale Kabri, you mentioned earlier. And there's a whole list. It's worthwhile going in there. I'm just looking at right now. Rivka Gruber. I mean, almost everyone you mentioned, and that's only on page 1. There's about, how many pages here? There's about I'm scrolling down, sorry. There are about more than 9 pages here. So it's a really amazing site for anyone who's interested in memoirs.
Yes, that's true. And we publicize the fact that Jewish Women's Archives has their own book club called Quarantine Book Club for the same reason we're having this book club. And they are very good resource as well. I believe the founding mission of the Jewish Women's Archives was some decades ago that women were not being recognized adequately and for their accomplishments in literature. I think things have improved over the years since its founding, but they still want to highlight the history and the literature from women that have been underrepresented in the canon of literature. So they're also very worthy. So and I
They also-
think they're having a book talk this Thursday, so you can go to that jwa.org book club and get more information from them. I think you have to register to get the Zoom connection for them. Or I sent it out in a couple of last week or 2 weeks ago.
Good.
Okay, anything else? And we're almost ready to wrap up. If anyone, we have a lot of reading to do, ladies. So I want to also explore where we're going next. So by the vote we had last time, we chose humor and satire, and that's maybe not as big a field as biography and memoir. I'd like an opinion, but we could be loose with the definition of humor and satire. It could be a book that is a little more lighthearted than some of the others, and have elements of humor and elements of satire, and not its total focus, I think. Again, we're looking backwards at classics as well as more recent books by men, by women, very open to that. So, and that will be on April 14th. We're skipping next week. And we'll see what the schedule is after that and how long this entire new condition we're living under continues. We hope to, I'd like to know if anyone has further ideas of what categories we should cover in the future. The mystery genre and any others that lend themselves to what we love to read by Jewish authors and others. You can you can speak out now or send me a note. Margie, did you have something to add?
I was going to end it with the global event of for healing that's this Sunday. I wanted to tell everybody about that, but finish your thought with the ladies.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. So let me first thank, and then we'll turn to Margie. Thank you, Rachel Kamen. Thank you, Susan Farber, for making those presentations and preparing with me. And thank you, Barbara Ezring, for recording. Thank you, Rabbi Ellen Mullins-Fields and Margie and everyone who presented a thought today. So with that, let's see.
I just have two things quickly. Sorry.
Yes.
Someone wrote in the chat about poetry on April 23rd and April 30th. It's going to be going out soon. We're going to be having a program about poetry. April is Poetry Month, and we actually, our new staff member, who is our communications and marketing director, Sarah Stern, who's on the call. We're 70 strong, so I don't know where she is exactly. She just waved. She's going to be teaching that. She is a poet. And so you'll be getting information about that. And then Vivian, I just wanted to tell you, Dale had her hand up. And there's some ideas in the chat also about historical fiction.
Okay, excellent. Let me turn back to Dale then first.
I don't know how you raise your hand on the other ways.
It's okay, I happened to see you, so it was good.
Thank you. I just know when one woman mentioned something about she didn't know about her book club being able to meet or whatever. Our book club.
That was me.
Yeah. Our book club did a Zoom book club meeting this past month for March, and we're going to try to do that again in April.
Okay.
I'm going to suggest it. It's older women, but very technologically savvy. So I am going to suggest that.
Let me introduce Sarah Stern. Would you speak so we can see you, please, Sarah? You're on. If you're on, I can't see you either.
There she
Yeah.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi, Sarah. Would you
Hi.
introduce yourself to us?
Yes, hi, I'm Sarah Stern, and I'm the new Director of Communications and Marketing
for WLCJ. So very nice to meet you and all. And I've really been enjoying these conversations. So thank you all who presented here, Rachel and Susan and Vivian. You have a PhD somewhere in your background, I think, with all your knowledge. Just a shout out of, I mean, so many great books mentioned, but if anyone has not read Angela's Ashes, that is definitely one you should read. One of my all-time favorites. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I will be teaching a workshop at the end of April, as the rabbi said. So hopefully there are some poets or poetry lovers or people who just would want to try to write a poem to come join us then.
Thank you. So Margie, please go ahead.
So just to end this program, and thank you, Vivian. You thanked everybody else, and thank you, Sarah, for mentioning Vivian. You do a fabulous job. If some of you are new, Women's League Reads is a virtual book group that we have within Women's League, and 4 times a year, Vivian and her entourage of brilliant women create a list, and we read books, and then a couple of weeks before the interview, Vivian posts questions and women chat about the book and if they like the development of a character, whatever their direction is. And then we only pick books if the author themselves, and we had 1 man through all the years and all the rest have been women, will be able to do a live interview. So there you are as a member of the Women's League Reads. It's free for all of you that you can be part of that live interview. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, make sure you reach Vivian